In this video, I'm going to be showing you how I make what I call a zero shimmy mold. It's a mold that keeps it from being overpressurized from human error of pushing too hard on the lid. I do find this to be a lot more successful than ones that you have to shimmy into place because oftentimes we do it wrong. Quick disclaimer before the tutorial starts, feel free to pause if you need to take the time to read it. I use 3 pieces of packaging tape and combine them together. You can buy wider rolls of packaging tape. It might be a bit easier, but I've always gotten away with doing this and it doesn't bug me too much. You just gotta be a bit more critical with ensuring that there isn't any gaps that are gonna affect anything where the silicone is gonna leak out. So that's why I will take my fingernail and I'll drag it across the top surface. It just ensures that there's good contact at some point, and then the silicone itself, as the weight of that is on top of it, it's not really gonna want to see through that, so it should be just fine. So the PBC coupling that I'm using for the mold can be found at Lowe's. It's a 4-inch in diameter one, and there's like a lip on the inside, and it's fairly reasonably priced at about $4, so not too bad. I do suggest removing any excess flashing that's on it. That'll just help ensure that it makes more even contact on the tape or whatever side you end up using, but the smooth side, try and stick with that. Before we apply the release agent, which is going to be Vaseline, I always try and ensure that the inside is nice and clean. I use 91% isopropyl alcohol. The outside we'll get to in a bit, but for now it's mainly the inside and the lip that's making contact with the tape that matters, so you definitely want those pretty clean. I use a small dab of Vaseline on my fingers and I just rub it on the inside of the PBC coupling. This will just help the silicone release from the coupling once you're ready to remove it. Now go ahead and press it firmly on the tape that you've prepared. And you don't want to press too hard. It looks like I'm doing it really hard in this, but that's just my table flexing. Now you're going to use your hot glue gun. I use just basic hot glue. If you use something like Gorilla Glue, it might be harder to remove later on, but something basic works fine. And you're going to take it against the corner of the coupling and just go around the perimeter, ensuring that there isn't any little gaps. And if you happen to miss a spot, or if you start to run out, as I did here, you could just start where you had left off and just continue. It doesn't have to be one continuous line all around. Just start where you had first left off. You don't have to do this, but I like to trim the excess tape. It just makes it less fiddly. That way it's not going to stick and grab onto anything, because the last thing you want is for all this hard work to get messed up because something had pulled on the tape. So now we're ready for the masters, and keep in mind that my D4 does look odd. Don't let that throw you off. That's from a previous cast that I had done because my original D4 master broke. Now put each dice master's lowest number down on the tape. If you happen to do it incorrectly, you could usually remove it without there being any issue and just gently put it back on the way it should be. One thing to note too is that my hand does obstruct a lot of this. I do apologize. It's very hard to capture this on camera. And when you do this too, make sure that your hand doesn't hit the inside of the wall of the PBC coupling and then end up getting onto the masters themselves when you're putting them in. You want to make sure that you're using clean hands, of course, but also that the Vaseline isn't somehow ever going to make contact or transfer onto those masters, because that can affect the final finish. You'll also notice an extra D6 that I'm adding. That's another pseudo master from a previous cast. I'm using that just because there is extra space in here and I like to have a little bit of redundancy. I give them a fair amount of spacing. I'll be honest, I eyeball it. I'm not breaking out a ruler and doing this, but you just want it to look sensible to where they're not gonna really get in each other's way when it comes to pouring your dice in the future. And also you want to leave enough room around the perimeter for when we go and cut our keys later, because if you don't leave yourself a lot of room for cutting the keys later on, then you're going to run into issues where you may accidentally cut into the mold cavity of the dice itself. And I'll be using my favorite silicone, which is BB Dino 30A. It's very easy to mix, low fumes. It's usually cheaper and more readily available. I've never had issues with it and I get phenomenal results with it. It being 30A, it's also substantially stronger than Dragon Skin's 20A, so I tend to get a bit more uses out of it. I accidentally started this pour directly on the master, You do usually want to avoid doing that in case you create bubbles over the numbers with how it's going to bridge over it, but usually you want to go high and slow between the masters, allowing it to rise slowly, and that'll ensure that there's the least chance of there being bubbles. And even all the little bubbles we're going to correct later in the pressure pot, but you just want to give it the best starting shot. And as far as how high you need to pour this, I go to where I can't see my largest dice anymore, which is the D20, and then I go just a little bit more. If you go too high, like to the lip of this PBC coupling, you're going to run into an issue where the silicone is so thick that it's extremely hard to remove your masters and your casts later on. It'll destroy your hands. Just don't do that. Don't go too high. Keep it a bit on the thinner side, but not too thin to where your thumb is going to actually punch a hole through the bottom of the silicone. It might take you a few mold making attempts to get that ratio just right, but it's fairly easy to identify by eye. You could even mark the inside of the coupling if you needed to, if you wanted an easy gauge to see how high you actually need to go. So now that that's done, I'm going to fill my air compressor, and when I put this mold in my pressure pot, I make sure that it's leveled out. I use an old retired scale that I have with the battery removed, that way there's no explosions or anything. It's not the best means of doing things, but I've done this ever since I started dice making. I've never had issues with this thing. I fill my pressure pot to a little over 40 psi. That way when I do my resin cast later, I shoot for around 40 or just under 40 psi. The reason why this is important is because if you don't cast your silicone at a higher pressure than you are your resin, there's going to be these micro bubbles within the walls of your silicone that you can't see, that resin will get pushed through. So you want to make sure when you make your silicone, cast at higher pressure than you are casting your resin when you go to do your pours. That is extremely important. Silicone cures quickly to where you can handle it, but usually not enough to where there's no risk of accidentally scarring it. So I usually give it about 2 to 4 days before I proceed with these next steps. Gently start to peel up the glue and the tape. I try and do it in kind of like a sharper, more peeled angle motion as opposed to just trying to rip it straight off from the top. You do want to do this very slowly because this will very slightly lift up the edges of the silicone from around the masters, and then it'll kind of lay back down to where it should be. If you're too aggressive with this, it might pull too much and the lip around the masters may not lay back to where it should be. I find this easiest to do when I'm also following the corners of each dice. It just tends to come off a lot more easily. If you didn't do a perfect job when you originally push these masters onto the tape, you still may get some flashing that's kind of crept in between the masters and the tape. Usually it's not too thick and you can just pull them off. I do prefer using my fingernail rather than a razor. I just find it less likely to accidentally mess up the masters or the mold doing it that way. It is a little bit choppier, but I'd rather play it safe than sorry, and the flashing that it leads anyways, it's little to nothing and it's very easy to sand off, so I don't stress over it. The flashing will be a bit thicker in areas where my pieces of tape had met, kind of like the seam line of it. You could also see the line from where I had previously dragged my fingernail, which by the way, it's not going to affect anything. Flashing in those areas tends to be a bit thicker. What I should have done previously was made sure that this master wasn't on the seam of the packaging tape. That would have helped a little bit in this area, but it's not too big of a deal. And to pick up these extra little pieces that I'm leaving around, I'll just use the packaging tape. It does a good job of it. Gently push your mold from the bottom to release it from the coupling, but don't do it quite all the way. We're going to do an extra step after this, which isn't necessary, but it'll help clean up the edges of the mold. You can use a cuticle cutter to clean up the edges of the mold and trim all that excess flashing. I will say that sometimes the flashing can get in the way of the lid sometimes when you install the lid because it kind of folds inward. So doing this just helps mitigate any potential small issues like that could cause an offset of the two mold halves meeting together. This mold flashing, it kind of cups upward, so I find that when you trim it off, it makes it easier for excess resin to come off of the mold so that you don't get as thick of flashing. It doesn't make the biggest difference in the world, but man, it sure does look nice and it works pretty well, so may as well do it. It's very simple to do. And once that's done, now you could remove the rest of the mold. When I cut my keys, I like to use a fresh, sharp blade. This just ensures that you get nice clean cuts. To make the lid of the mold seat on its own without any effort of needing to push or shimmy it into place, you need to cut these at an angle. Just kind of eyeball it at about what I'm doing here. It doesn't have to be an extreme angle, but enough to where it's going to kind of settle in on its own. And I start with these side cuts first, keeping them parallel to each other and kind of eyeballing the depth, trying to keep those even. And then I'll start at the back side. It's always hard to get this perfect just right. If you go a little too far, it's no big deal, but you just want to kind of match it the best you can and free it up. If the back side is struggling too, if you're gonna go deep enough, just kind of fillet it a little bit, keeping it as even as you can. If it looks a little choppy, that's okay. And then after this, you're gonna do the bottom. Be very careful doing this because it's easy to go too deep when you do this part, and just get it to where you see it free up, and then it should pop right out. Now notice how I cut too far in some of these. That's not gonna be a big deal. The only time that's gonna be an issue is if you're pulling your mold too hard and you end up stretching those parts. It may end up ripping further and getting kind of wonky, but the little choppiness, it's okay. It should line up just fine. I like to use 4 keys for these molds in the more open spaces when I cut them. I have to go at a bit of an angle at the top one, but that's no big deal. They don't have to be very deep too. Once I was done cutting all 4, this is what they look like, and they don't all have to be matching and identical. They could be slightly different in their own unique way. Using a disposable makeup applicator, Q-tip thing, whatever you want to call them, you're going to spread a thin amount of Vaseline around your masters, and not only that, but here's a huge tip. Actually put it directly on the master's edges themselves. That way you're not eyeballing mere millimeters of where they need to be, because these trail marks, let me tell you, they're going to sand really, really easily when you do your cast. They're not going to show. So it's no big deal. Here's what it looks like in different lighting conditions. So it's not crazy thick, it's nice and smoothed out. If you happen to get a little bit too much of a glob in one area, you could easily smooth that out and it'll work out no problem. And make sure that you get the contours and the little possibly choppy areas in your keys pretty well coated. That way they don't end up fused to the new silicone we're going to be pouring. Just make sure you get them in those corners and the edges pretty well. Do not forget about the edges of the silicone too, especially if you use the cuticle cutter, because it might leave a little channel where that silicone may end up kind of adhering itself to. It just makes it a little bit easier when you have to separate it. Once it's been applied everywhere where the keys and the top surface of the mold is at, this is what it looks like in different lighting conditions. That way you get an idea of the elevation. And before we put the mold back in, we're going to clean up the outside and the inside of the mold. The outside I'm actually going to leave pretty dirty just to show you how confident I am in this method and how well the tape applied to the outside can work, even when there's bubbles for the silicone to slightly leak through, because it's not as big of a deal as some people make it out to. I see pictures and videos where people glue the tape on the outside of the coupling for when they're damming it up for any of the excess in case it drips out, and I find it not very necessary. And then go ahead and coat the inside again with Vaseline with your finger, just as we did previously. Gently shimmy the mold back into place. Try and push in areas where there isn't a master located. Just find those empty spaces and work around the mold. Don't push only on one spot. This is a very gentle process, and if you mess it up, you may end up pulling some of the mold material away from the master, and it may not want to lay back again, especially with the chance of the release agent, the Vaseline, getting between the master and the mold. That would be worst case scenario. Oh, my voice messed up there. That would be a worst case scenario. You could also check the bottom just to make sure that it's made contact with that inside lip of the coupling. Taking a single piece of tape, I'm going to go around the perimeter to create the dam. This isn't necessary if you're not going to have excess, but I do like the excess. That way I have that additional weight for when the mold seats into place. I'd seen other methods where people will put even like ball bearings in the mold and like a 2-stage carrying process for the lid so that they can do that to create some weight, but I don't know how much more that would be as far as work and price, but I just prefer the little extra silicone. It's no big deal. And you're going to see these bubbles, which are sometimes almost hard to get 100% removed. The creases, I could have done a better job, but again, I'm going to leave this imperfect just to show you how confident I am in this method. And now go ahead and mix up some more silicone, and we're going to get ready to pour the lid. And a little tip with this, if you have excess splotches on the rim of the cup, don't worry about that, just leave them if they're not making contact with anything. Pour out of the clean side. Just like before too, pour high and slow, avoid directly pouring on the masters initially, and then once it's all kind of full, you can just kind of pour wherever you want, still keeping it high and slow. And when it gets up to the tape, don't freak out if you see some of it leaking through some of the bubbles within the tape. If you've done a fair job, I'm not going to say a perfect job because again, I'm making this imperfect on purpose. Don't worry about it. It should be fine, and it does cure fairly quickly. Look how kind of bad this looks. It's not the best, but hey, it's gonna work. It's gonna leave a little excess flashing you could cut, and I'm not freaking out. It'll be just fine. Now you can move it to your leveled surface in your pressure pot and go ahead and allow that to cure. And once it's ready, go ahead and remove that tape, and you'll see the flashing isn't too bad and it didn't leak a crazy amount. The surface of this lid, it doesn't have to be perfect too. It's probably one of the only parts of the mold that you have to worry the least about. It can be imperfect and work just fine. The lid is the least necessary thing to trim, but I do it anyways just because I don't like these things dangling around, and it just cleans it up. I think it looks a bit better in photos too. You can also do this to the underside, but I'm not going to do that for this video, but I am going to lift and free it up from the PBC coupling. That way I could prepare to slowly extract it, which is going to be a bit more difficult this time. You could try and do it from the bottom, but it's going to be very tight sometimes, even if you've done the best job you can. So if you gently start from the lid itself and just kind of shimmy it, the lid itself may end up detaching from the bottom part of the mold as you do this, so just be careful. Now that that's finally out, if it's not already freed up on the edges, go ahead and do that gently. It shouldn't be a thick amount of material that's adhering to each other. If it is though, just take a razor and gently help it out. And then you're gonna try and do this in a peeling motion when you remove the two pieces for the first time. This will just help ensure that nothing's really gonna rip and get all crazy on you. And this is what it looks like. It came out very clean and I'm super satisfied with it. Here's what it looks like in different lighting conditions. I like to trim the inside edges as well. You can do this on the outer edge of the keys too if you wanted. It shouldn't affect the key placement position because you still have that inner portion. Like I said, you don't have to do this, it's just an additional step. But I find that it helps a little bit when it comes to the excess resin draining. It's just less material in the way of it. And any excess pieces, you could just go ahead and clean up with tape. Pulling and stretching the mold easily will help free up the masters from the mold. It being a fresh mold too, they are going to grab quite a bit, but just do the best you can to do that and then gently roll them out or pop them out. You don't want to be too aggressive with it on some of these because the corner will end up dragging on the inside and leave these marks on the inside of the mold cavity. So just be gentle with it and take your time. Don't launch them across the room. That's how I accidentally broke my D4 originally. That's why I'm using that pseudo master. On fresh molds, I like to break them in gently by just reinstalling the mold and then removing it repeatedly. And you'll see how easy this is right off the bat. It's sliding into place without the need for much shimmying, but the more you remove and install it and do this very simple break-in process, that just helps with keeping memory to it a bit better. That way when you go to do your first cast, there's no chance of it slightly lifting and without the need of you having to push too much. So you'll see it is going right back in and it's perfectly fine. Look at that. You'll probably see some gaps between the keys even when it is technically seated completely to where you're not going to have issues, but these slight gaps, they're not really going to do much of anything, I find. If it's fairly noticeable though, and it's a bit larger than what these look like, then it very well may be shifted in a way where it shouldn't be. This is what my old molds used to look like. They had larger outer keys and 3 inner keys. I did have to shimmy aggressively to get them to seat, and that would actually push too much resin out. And you'll notice the difference in coloration. A used mold will tend to pale, and then newer molds, they'll have kind of a brighter hue to them. That is normal as they naturally dry out and wear over time. I also didn't apply Vaseline directly on the edges, which left me with pretty hard flashing to remove. You'll see these kind of chunks that came out from the lid. That's from the 2 mold halves ripping when they were separated for the first time. And now you'll see this is actually the worst one out of the new one I just did in this video, and that's significantly better than what those look like. So even at the worst, it's turning out really well. Also, with these older molds, they may develop these cracks kind of on the edges of where you're pushing it out from the mold. That is normal, and it will happen sometime during its lifespan. Don't let that freak you out though. Just keep on using them. They usually don't leave much of any kind of defect on the casted resin themselves. I would only look at replacing the mold when they start pulling numbers, because usually the numbers will go, and at that point it kind of messes up the whole thing. This is my old mold that I just wanted to show off. This is kind of where I came from. This was with Dragon Skin 20. It was very slapped together with a container that I recycled and with terribly cut keys. I had all sorts of leaks and issues, but yeah, it's just kind of funny to look back at. Alright, so it's time to do the first test of this mold, and some people, they do clean their mold before starting to do cast from them in resin, but I found that with a very light amount of this Vaseline that we're using, the silicone itself, it absorbs it enough to where you actually really don't have to worry about it. It's up to you though. I would just do it with a light amount of isopropyl alcohol if that's something that you intend to do, just to be safe. Just be careful, because you don't want to get like a lot of material from paper towels and stuff stuck on there like little fuzzies. That's also why some people consider their first pour like a scratch pour, just to essentially clear out anything that could be in there that they didn't catch. And once that's cured, you're going to pull it apart very gently. And I like to break it up similar to how when you first release the masters, it's kind of the same thing. You're breaking off the flashing around the edges of the cat faces, just to make it easier for when you go to put tape on them. If you plan to do that, it makes removing the flashing a lot easier. And then any small bits that it didn't happen to pick up, you're just going to pull that off with your fingers. Very gently push them out from the bottom, and they should just kind of roll right out. Like I said previously too, this is a new mold, so it's going to grab a lot initially, and over the span of the life of the mold, it should be easier to free up these numbers. But just take your time with it and be gentle. And this is the final result of all those dice from this pour. They turned out amazing, nice and shiny. I'm not going to show the sanding procedure on how I get these nice and polished. That may be for a later video, but I just wanted to show the raw results straight from the mold. If this has helped you, go ahead and let me know in the comments. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask, and I'll help as much as I can. I really do love this community.